Hi, welcome to our channel of IGNOU audiobooks. Indira Gandhi National Open University, School of Continuing Education, Bachelor's Degree Program, Elective Course, Gender Studies, BGSE-001 Gender Sensitization, Society, Culture and Change, Block 3 Gender and Work Unit 8 Gendering Work. 8.1 Introduction. In this first unit of Block 3, you will read about both traditional and contemporary discourses on work focusing on productive, reproductive, and unpaid work carried out by women. After this, you will read about standards for measurement of work and why there are gender gaps in labor force participation. The unit ends with a discussion on gender discrimination and its impact on women in workforce, followed by conclusion. Let's us now look at the objectives of reading this unit. 8.2 Objectives. After reading this unit, you will be able to times define work, times discuss traditional and contemporary discourses of work, times describe international standards of measurement of work, and times analyze the reasons of gender gap in labor force participation and gender discrimination at workplace. Let us begin with reading traditional discourses in the realm of work. 8.3 Traditional discourses. We have read of early human societies which were egalitarian. Men hunted, fished, and provided necessary raw materials for food and made tools necessary for these tasks. Women cared for the house, prepared food, clothing, and looked after children. Women were the center of communistic household, and she alone knew who was the father of her children. Things changed when human communities moved from nomadic existence to living in a stable arrangement and same environment for long period of time. It was the time when a household was set up. Thus, the growing significance of production changed the nature of communistic society. With accumulation of wealth, the relationship between men and women changed as all wealth was a result of production, which was a male activity. Production was more valued than running of a household and household labor. According to traditional economic theories, life is divided into 1. Economic realm and 2. Household realm. The economic realm focused on buyers, sellers, market, whereas the household realm positioned itself on the range of unpaid work that is necessary for the functioning of life. Only items that are sold in market are counted as production, hence household realm was outside the purview of economic realm. We define work as any activity or expenditure of energy that produces services and products of value to other people. Although work can be performed without wages, salaries, or income. Economically speaking, labor market work is strictly work performed for pay. Work is productive if and only if profits are produced. The capitalist system regards women merely as a convenient source of cheap labor and part of the reserve army of labor to be drawn on when there is a shortage of labor in certain areas of production, and discarded this category of labor. Read women, again when the need disappears. We saw this in both world wars, when women were employed into the factories to replace men who had been called up into the army and then sent back home when the war got over. Women were again encouraged to enter the workplaces during the period of capitalist upswing of 1950s and 1960s, when their role was analogous to that of the immigrant workers, that is, as a reservoir of cheap labor. Benaria et al. 1981. Throughout the history, capitalism has proved adept at causing change in patterns of labor supply in accordance with demand, and this is particularly so in the case of use of female labor. In all societies, particularly in developing countries, essential but usually unpaid activities such as cooking, cleaning and other housework, child care, care of the sick and the elderly, as well as community-based activities, which are largely seen as the responsibility of women. This pattern of unpaid work tends to exist even when women are engaged in work outside of home for an income, whether as wage workers or self-employed workers. Women from poor families who are engaged in outside work cannot afford to hire others to perform these unpaid tasks. So most often these are passed on to young girls and elderly women within the household. It becomes a double burden of work for women who have no support. These processes are also integral to capitalism and have become even more marked in recent years. Ghosh. Let us now read some of the contemporary discourses on women and work. 8.4 Contemporary Discourses. The assumptions of traditional economics had devastating consequences on women. Feminist economics grew in response to the restricted and inadequate view of the economy offered by mainstream economic thinking. In this context, one of the key challenges for feminist economics was to make visible the so-called invisible or unpaid economy. Productive and reproductive work. The tendency of highlighting the unpaid economic work has a long-standing history. Within the debates on gender and development, Danish economist Esther Bostrup in her work Women's Role in Economic Development, 1970, has highlighted women's importance to the agricultural economy. Sub-Saharan Africa, in particular, was singled out as the great global area of female farming systems in which women using traditional hoe technology assumed a substantial responsibility for food production. Moreover, Bosra posited a positive correlation between the role women played in agricultural production and their status vis-à-vis men. Instead of needy beneficiaries, her work represented women as productive members of society. One of the most pervasive themes of the present feminist movement is the emphasis placed on the role of reproduction. Women do most of the unpaid work of households, tasks such as preparing meals for the family, cleaning the house, and gathering water and fuel, as well as caring for children, older people, and family members who are sick. Women in India do almost 10 times the amount of unpaid care work that men do. Three-quarters of unpaid work is routine household chores aggravated by poor access to basic services such as sanitation, clean water, and clean sources of cooking fuel. In China and Bangladesh, to consider two other Asian countries for comparative purposes, women do about 3 and 4 times, respectively, the amount of unpaid care work as men. NGI, 2015. In 2015, the global labor force participation rate was 50% for women but 77% for men. Female participation in the labor force and employment rates are affected heavily by economic, social and cultural issues and care work distributions in the home. Human Development Report, 2015, states that women are estimated to contribute 52% of global work, men 48%. But even if women carry more than half the burden, they are disadvantaged in both realms of work, paid as well as unpaid work, in patterns that reinforce each other. Of the 59% of work that is paid, mostly outside the home, men's share, 38%, is nearly twice that of women, 21%. The picture is reversed for unpaid work, mostly within the home and encompassing a range of care responsibilities. Of the 41% of work that is unpaid, women perform 3 times, 30%, than men, 10%. Hence, the imbalance. Men dominate the world of paid work, women that of unpaid work. Fig. 1. Paid work at home is indispensable to the functioning of society and human well-being. When it falls primarily on women, it limits their choices and opportunities for other activities that could be more fulfilling to them. Even when women are in paid work, they face disadvantages and discrimination. The evidence of the glass ceiling is just one of them. Women are underrepresented in senior management positions. Globally, occupational segregation is common, seen over time and across levels of economic prosperity. In both advanced and developing countries, men are overrepresented in crafts, trades, plant and machine operations, and managerial and legislative occupations, and women in mid-skill occupations such as clerks, service workers, and shop and sales workers. Even when doing similar work, women earn less, with the wage gaps generally greatest for the highest paid professionals. 1. Due to their disproportionate share of care work, women have less time than men for other activities, including paid work and education. In low human development countries, men spend nearly 30% more time on social life and leisure than women. 2. Despite the importance for human development, care work often goes unrecognized. Among all countries attempting to measure the value of unpaid care work, estimates range from 20% to 60% of GDP. In India, unpaid care is estimated at 39% of GDP. In South Africa, 15%. When women have no choice but to give priority to unpaid work and stay out of the labor force, they make large sacrifices, perhaps missing the chance to expand their capabilities in the workplace. They also lose opportunities for economic independence. In order to understand dynamics of gender and work, the nature of sex discrimination, wages, participation in the development process, and implications for political action, analysts must examine the two areas of production and reproduction as well as the interaction between them. A variety of recent studies on women in third world countries have focused on the interaction between production and reproduction to analyze women's work. Maria Mees, 1981, study of Indian women lace makers in Narsapur, Andhra Pradesh, for example, shows how the seclusion of women has conditioned their participation in non-household production. Although lace making is a producing industry geared toward the international market, it is highly compatible with seclusion and domestic work. Women are engaged in lace making as much as 6 to 8 hours a day, in addition to their household chores. Their average daily earnings amount to less than a third of the official minimum wage for female agricultural laborers. This situation persists, even though the industry has grown considerably since 1970 and represents a very high proportion of the foreign exchange earnings from handicrafts in the region. Many of the women are the actual breadwinners in their families. Mies argues that this highly exploitative system has, in fact, led to greater class differentiation within local communities as well as greater polarization between the sexes. The system is made possible by the ideology of seclusion that rigidly confines women to the home, eliminates their opportunities for outside work, and makes them willing to accept extremely low wages. For lace makers, caste and gender work to transform beliefs about women's unequal status and power in a private sphere into hierarchical ordering in which women's work in production of lace is conceptualized as a leisure activity with little pay and where the products and proceeds of this industry are controlled by men. Expansion of lace industry into the global market led not only to class differentiation within particular communities, but also to the masculinization of all non-production jobs. Paid care work. Globally, an estimated 53 million people ages 15 and older are in paid domestic work. Of these, 83% are women, some migrant workers, UNDP, 2015. And so a global care work chain has emerged where migrant domestic workers undertake housework and provide care to children and others in households abroad. They often leave behind their own children and parents in their homeland, creating a care gap often filled by grandparents, other relatives, or hired local helpers. Despite the possible abuse in domestic work, low wages, poor working conditions, no access to medical care, and physical or sexual abuse. Many workers feel obliged to remain with abusive employers because they need the income that comes from work. Check your progress. 1. Define what is understood by work. 2. Who is reserved army of women? Why? 3. What do you understand by productive and reproductive work? 8.5 Standards for measurement of work. Attempts were made to include subsistence production in the national accounts of some countries in the 1950s and 1960s, but it was the push by the women's movement in the 1970s which really focused on the importance of non-market production. Esther Bosrup's foundational 1970 work, Women's Role in Economic Development, clearly showed the key role of subsistence production in third world economies and the pivotal role of women in those economies. Her argument for counting many of these women's activities was that they were part of subsistence production and women's household labor was productive. However, later this argument was taken up by the feminist movement. And Oakley's foundational work in the early 1970s was followed by a series of studies which clearly saw housework as work, as productive, and as done mainly by women. According to the United Nations System of National Accounts of 1993, SNA, which provides the conceptual framework that sets the international statistical standard for the measurement and classification of economic activities, some unpaid work activities are deemed economic work and, much like paid work, are considered to belong within the SNA production boundary. Other unpaid work activities are classified as non-economic. Government employment guarantee programs and time allocation of women. Newly created employment opportunities can serve as a vehicle for transforming women's lives by reducing the unpaid work burden and, thus, altering the paid-unpaid gender division of labor. In some cases, this will translate to prioritizing public investment in infrastructure that reduces unpaid work, such as rural water projects, feeder roads, etc. The importance of employment guarantee programs is that, if well designed, they can reduce unpaid work while redistributing the cost of reproduction by creating jobs for both women and men instead of reinforcing the existing gender-based division of unpaid labor. If such projects are not gender-informed, the danger is that they may create a typical double-day effect for women. Chakrabarti, 2008. 8.6 Gender gaps in labor force participation and economy. Gender inequality is a pressing human issue, but also has huge ramifications for jobs, productivity, GDP growth, and inequality. The economic potential of India's women is not achievable without gender gaps in society being addressed. India has a lower share of women's contribution to GDP than the global average of 37% and the lowest among all regions in the world. India's economy would have the highest relative boost among all regions of the world if its women participated in paid work in the market economy on a similar basis to men, erasing the current gaps in labor force participation rates, hours work, and representation within each sector, which affects their productivity. The barriers hindering women from participating in the labor market at par with men are unlikely to be fully addressed within that time frame, and because, ultimately, such participation is a matter of personal choice. The role of women in the workplace cannot be viewed in isolation from their role in society. Achieving the economic potential of women requires gender gaps in both work and in society to be narrowed as equality in one goes hand in hand with equality in the other. Data from India's National Sample Survey Offices, NSSO, surveys indicate that women's labor force participation is significantly lower than that of men in both urban and rural areas. Based on data for the population aged 15 and over, India's female labor force participation rate is just 21% in urban areas and 36% in rural areas compared to 76% and 81%, respectively, in the case of men. Chaudhary and Verick, 2014. About 75% of female employment is in rural areas is in agriculture, compared with 59% for men. In the unorganized sector also, men are more likely to be employers, women are more likely to be wage workers or unpaid family workers. Men are more likely to own large enterprises, women, if at all, they own an enterprise, they own small ones. Women's work is generally manual and unskilled. A majority of self-employed women are home-based workers, that is, producing for the market in their own homes. There is a hierarchy of poverty risk associated with the segmentation of the labor force, with women concentrated in forms of employment with high risks of poverty. Chen et al. 2005. Fig. 8.2 Segmentation of the unorganized sector workers. The Global Gender Gap Report, 2014, reveals a widespread perception that women are paid lower wages compared with men for the same work. Analyzing 68th round National Sample Surveys, NSSO, wage data by occupation for India appears to support this trend. Irrespective of the professional level, women on average get paid 30% less than their male counterparts. Drawing on NSSO data, McKinsey Global Institute, MGI, 2015, identified a gender gap in leadership among Indian women. Only 7% of tertiary educated women have jobs as senior officials compared with 14% of men. Similarly, women account for only 38% of all professional technical jobs. Women constitute just 5% of the boards of companies in India. This means that at the 9,000 listed firms in the country, there are only 400 women board members. These figures may not present a complete picture, as 200 of them belong to family-owned firms. So, the number of women who have actually climbed the ladder is just a sad fraction. Economic Times, 2010. In 2014, Securities and Exchange Board of India, SEBI, had directed the companies listed on National Stock Exchange to appoint at least one woman director on their board by the month of October in the same year. The presence of a compulsory female member on the board would ensure the implementation of more women-oriented policies. However, more than 200 companies have failed to comply with the directive as of April 2015, resulting in imposition of fines. This shows the general attitude towards the potential of women work. Ruchira Singh, 2015. Underlying social attitudes about the role of women are, arguably, some of the biggest barriers India's women face. MGI, 2015, found a strong link between attitudes that limit women's potential and actual gender equality outcomes in a given region. For instance, the survey asked respondents, both men and women, whether they agree with the following statements: when jobs are scarce, men should have more right to a job than women, and when a mother works for pay, the children suffer. More than half of the respondents in India agreed with both the statements. India has some of the world's lowest rates of women's labor force participation. 8.7 Gender discrimination, violence, and vulnerability at work. Workplace or occupational violence in the form of threats, physical or verbal nonverbal abuse is also a concern for many workers. Sexual harassment can be perpetrated by a range of people including employers, employees, contractors, and clients. It can be subtle or overt and could be deliberate or unintended. The type of harassment vary from the abuse of authority or position to relations among co-workers and affiliated personnel to inappropriate behavior towards consultants, clients, and members of public. In situations where there are a large number of young women and limited job opportunities, sexual harassment can be common during hiring and recruitment processes. Why explain other particularly vulnerable? Populations of women include those working in educational and training institutions, domestic workers, migrant workers, workers with little job security, and workers in occupations where large numbers of women are supervised by small numbers of men. Human trafficking is another form of violence against women and girls, which is the most lucrative, illicit business worldwide. Between 2007 and 2010, trafficked victims of 136 nationalities were detected in 118 countries. Some 55 to 60% of the victims were women. Most were trafficked for sexual exploitation or for working as forced labor. Exploitation is common in paid domestic work, particularly for female migrant workers in developing countries. In people's homes, exploitation often remains outside the scope of labor law. Employers use threats and coercion to pay low or even no wages. They can force domestic workers to work long hours up to 18 hours a day, without days off, limiting their movements and potential for social interaction. Working conditions are often poor, with little food and no access to medical care. Domestic workers may also be subjected to physical or sexual abuse. Even so, many domestic workers feel obliged to remain with abusive employers because they need to work to support their families. In the following box are some reflection from work scenario of women. Seizing every opportunity, sizing every situation, some of the issues faced by women in employment. Poverty and limited education push women into labor markets at an early age, but the sheer economic reason of getting better incomes pushes them out of other labor markets and into sex work. This was revealed by a path-breaking pan-India survey of sex workers conducted in 2009. When men move for work, it is taken for granted that their wives would follow them, even at the cost of disrupting their own careers. Defying this age-old norm is a small but increasing number of women. From the field of journalism, we hear that some prominent women journalists have made their way into highest echelons of new television, where most women in the field face the glass ceiling and remain contented with modest profiles, performing drudge work. For many construction workers in the metro cities, is a choice between starvation in their villages or exploitation and unhealthy environment in the cities. There is no social protection for workers in the informal sector. About a quarter of total workforce in the Indian BPO sector comprise women, and they confine to lower echelons of this $40 billion industry. But the real life of women details severe health issues due to constantly tiring eye muscles, depression, digestive issues, and the fear of darkness, due to odd timings of work. Philippos and Bishnoi, 2013. Let us now read some recommendations to change the scene of work for women in India. Recommendations. In the present scenario, deep-rooted social norms and practices underpinning gender inequalities leave women and girls with limited choices and opportunities. To overcome the situation, there is a need to close gender gaps in secondary and tertiary education in India's large states, lower barriers to job creation, expand skills training for women in key sectors, expand the reach of financial and digital services to enable women entrepreneurs, step up gender diversity policies and practices in organizations, strengthen legal provisions for women and the enforcement of laws, improve infrastructure and services to address the high burden of routine domestic work, childcare, and care elder, reshape deep-rooted attitudes about the role of women in work and in the society. Many societies are experiencing a generational shift, particularly in educated middle-class households, towards greater sharing of care work between men and women. But much remains to be done, and action needs to happen quickly to address deep gender inequalities in the realm of work. 8.8 Summing UP. In this unit, we have read traditional and contemporary discourses on women and work. The learners are also introduced the concepts and detailed descriptions with appropriate statistical example of productive and reproductive work, paid and unpaid work. They have also introduced the existing studies related to gender and work. We have also discussed standards for measurement of work. Along with that, we have introduced the concept United Nations System of National Account of 1993, SNA. We have also discussed the violence related to workplace, gender discrimination at work, and women's vulnerability. 8.9 Keywords. United Nations Development Programme, UNDP works in nearly 170 countries and territories, helping to achieve the eradication of poverty and the reduction of inequalities and exclusion. UNDP helps countries to develop policies, leadership skills, partnering abilities, institutional capabilities, and build resilience in order to sustain development results. Last year, world leaders adopted the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development to continue the work of the Millennium Development Goals. UNDP is working to strengthen new frameworks for development, disaster risk reduction, and climate change. UNDP supports countries' efforts to achieve the new Sustainable Development Goals, or global goals, which will guide global development priorities for the next 15 years. UNDP focuses on helping countries build and share solutions in three main areas: times sustainable development, times democratic governance and peace building, times climate and disaster resilience. They encourage the protection of human rights and the empowerment of women, minorities, and the poorest and most vulnerable. The annual Human Development Report, commissioned by UNDP, focuses the global debate on key development issues, providing new measurement tools, innovative analysis, and often controversial policy proposals. The global report's analytical framework and inclusive approach carry over into regional, national, and local human development reports, also supported by UNDP. 8.10 Unit End Questions. 1. Explain contemporary discourses related to women and work with suitable examples. 2. Discuss the issues related to gender-based violence at work.
Thank you for watching. We will see you in the next video with the next chapter.